welcome back to the Unfiltered podcast. The Unfiltered, I'm already stumbling, but it's unfiltered, so you got what you got, you know?
You get the point.
Yeah, we're not redoing it, so here we are.
Change the name.
Just
for like comedic effect.
Yeah.
Unfiltered.
Unfiltered. For this episode, it'll be called Unfiltered.
Yeah.
We can change the logo and everything. That's a big commitment. Anyway, yeah, today, guys, we are continuing with our little Bible series that we got going on.
Whoops.
With a little bit of a flair, if you will. Because the other two that we did were about Moses and Saul. We talked about them. Two men in the Bible, also very different from each other. Well, kind of. We talk about it, but you can watch the episodes. But anyway. But in this episode, we're going to talk about some women in the Bible.
Yes.
Because we're a panel of women, so might as well, you know?
Girls.
Girls who run the world, girls.
Jesus.
Yeah, I actually don't believe in that. I just thought it would be fun.
It would be fitting.
We always sing a song. We needed to sing a song.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
always in every
We judge
Unfiltered
Abby for
episode,
it, but
there's
Yeah.
a song that is sung.
But at least we knew this one.
Okay, bueno.
Yeah. Just
Fair enough. Anyways,
just adjusting.
today we're gonna kind of dive into a story, more or less, if we're being honest. But the characters that we're talking about are Hagar and
Whoa.
Sarah.
No way.
Yeah, I know.
Hmm.
You guys didn't
So
know.
we're doing a
that.
twofer.
Yeah, kind of.
2 for 1.
Because we were kind of chatting before, like, we started recording, and we
Yeah.
were like, it's kind of hard to like separate these two women's stories.
Yeah.
Like they're very intertwined with one another, and also like all the characters in the like Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, all of their stories are very like they kind of come in a group. So like the idea is to dive a bit deeper maybe into Hagar and Sarah, especially to like, as we know in Bible times, women weren't seen as much as equals as men, and so a lot of their stories are quite short, quite small. So they're kind of like, not, I wouldn't say lesser known, but definitely like less talked about than the rest of the men that we have on the Bible, you know? Yeah. So that's also kind of why we thought it would be good to put two together, to kind of dive a bit deeper into maybe some characters that we kind of glaze over sometimes. Because I was talking to Julie earlier and we were like, dang, this story is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And she was saying about how, I think you also mentioned this in the Moses episode, but you were saying how like when we're kids, we like watch The Prince of Egypt, or I don't know, you like go to Sunday school and you learn these like stories. Like I like Noah, for example, you know, like Noah, he had 2 giraffes and he had 2 rhinos and he had 2 lions, and you're like a kid and you're coloring it in. You're like, what a lovely story. And then you read it when you're older and you're like, oh my Lord, guy was drunk. Like everything's going crazy. Like what is going on? You know, it's a crazy story. God's like, I want to wipe them all out. We're not talking about Noah today. But anyway, I don't know. I'm diving into it, but
It was the whole point. It was a crazy story.
exactly.
Yeah.
As is this one.
Yeah.
It's a pretty crazy story. So yes, we're talking about Hagar and Sarah, which is in, what was it? Genesis 16. Yeah. And it kind of starts where like right before Abraham turns into Abraham. He's just Abram.
Oh, Abram.
And Sarah is Sarai.
Sarai.
I
Yeah.
hope I'm not butchering that. And yeah, we kind of like start the story there. Like that's kind of when we first hear about Hagar.
Yeah. Which we also mentioned this before, and I want to confess or slash like also advise people out there who like just get too comfortable with their upbringing, that like I think we like lean on our feelings for like each Bible character according to how we grew up with them.
Yeah.
So I think everybody like looks at Abraham and we think of this like really old wise man who sits on a couch like yours, you know, very much like, yeah, exactly. With like this long beard, you know, because he's the father of the nation. So he's almost like Father Christmas in a sense, you know, like ho, ho, ho. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Had Father Abraham, I am one of them, and so are you.
Ishmael.
Yeah, but like we have this like fond, like really cute memory about it in a way, you know. But in the same way that we were talking last time about Saul and David and even like about Moses and stuff, like Abraham was just like anybody, like any one of us. But like the more I read into this, the more that I was like, oh, Abraham. Yeah. Like you're not that, like you're like not the Father Christmas that I thought about.
He was making some choices.
He was, and it was a bit disturbing to say
But I
the
think
least.
that's also why we wanted to do this.
Yeah.
Like looking at characters and looking at their humanity, you know,
Yeah.
like that they are humans like us. So even reading
Yeah.
this, it's like, oh my gosh, Sarah or Sarai.
Yeah.
But I'm
Sarai.
also like, I've seen a little bit of Sarai in myself.
Oh,
you
yeah,
know,
for sure.
Or
100%.
in others around me or whatever. And not in like a judgmental way, but like
In a
it's
real
true
way.
that we
yeah.
look at Bible characters when we're younger and we're like, wow, the idols of the Bible, not in an idolatrous
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
but like, wow, they were so heroic or they
Yeah.
were so amazing. And they were, but they also were freaking fallen,
Yeah.
you know, because of humanity.
Yeah.
So it's really encouraging, I think.
Also
Yeah.
helps a lot to like see our humanity as like the God can still use it, you know, like when we feel the worst and we're like, oh, we did the worst, and then we see these people and that God still used them to do something big. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's
Yeah, it's true.
that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also Hagar's story is a real good example of that, you know.
Yeah.
She's a real good example of like getting handed some really crappy life
Yeah.
experiences.
And she doesn't have a lot of space in the Bible. Just
Yeah.
like one chapter, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And God's so good to her.
Uh-huh.
So
it's,
good.
It's really
Yeah.
cool actually. But yeah, beginning of the story.
Yeah.
We
Well, should we
hear
go
about
to the
Hagar.
beginning of the story?
In
the
the
beginning.
beginning.
Adam and
In
Eve.
the beginning. In the beginning. In the beginning.
What is the beginning?
Yeah,
What do you mean?
Okay.
Oh,
So
she has some
She's
insight.
got tea. She's got
Oh.
biblical tea.
I got biblical tea. There's coffee in my hand, which I feel like it's a betrayal. But anyways, so because Genesis 16, which is what we're reading, which is
Yeah.
basically like the point where Hagar comes into the story, when Sarah or Sarai says to Abraham, like, take my servant Hagar and go have relations with her so that she can bear a child for us. What brings to question here is who's Hagar and why do they have a slave,
Yeah, Egyptians. Like,
an Egyptian slave?
yeah.
Okay, let's think about like, you know.
That's a good point, Julie.
Yeah,
I think you're
thank
going
you.
to tell us why.
I'm going to tell you, yes. So, which is really important to understand also like what she does because
We're getting comfortable.
so uncomfortable. So sorry.
I thought you were getting excited, but okay, cool.
Like, I'm trying to get in the right position to harness my excitement. You know?
Okay, cool.
You want to
Yeah.
swap?
No, babes.
Oh.
Fine.
So, a few years before this, there's what is it? The
Flood.
famine? No, yeah, like they basically have no food, no nothing, whatever.
Famine, yeah.
A famine, yeah. And so Abraham and Sarah like leave and they go to Egypt to try and find some food and find something. And Abraham, right, yeah, and Abraham at that point, Abram, turns around and says, "You, my dear, are very beautiful.
Oh.
So
Oh.
when we get to Egypt,
Yes.
they will know that you're my wife and they will kill
Oh
me."
yeah, I forgot about this.
Yes, very important.
I don't think I
Me
know this.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. So they
It's
said,
Biblical
tea.
tea.
Yeah, biblical tea.
It's getting spilled.
Abraham said, "My darling,
Oh.
you're so beautiful
Oh.
that if they know that you're my wife, they will kill me." Right?
Aren't they really old at this point, though?
Well, no, he's like 80 at this point because I think this was like 5 or 10 years before this story.
Oh, okay.
Basically, I think
Okay,
it's like
still
5
old.
years. Still
Yeah,
old.
but, like,
He's like
biblical,
85
yeah.
at least.
But I
You know?
think that's young for them at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
'Cause they lived
And,
for like 900.
and she was like, I think 30 or 40
Just like
years
you.
younger than him.
Sorry.
We're
It's
doing
so good.
biblical tea.
That was tea in real life.
Yeah.
I missed the tea. What happened? It's too far
She's
away.
telling the story. We're like,
Watch
wow,
the
that's-
podcast.
Watch the podcast.
She's like, and then Abram. Side combo.
Anyways, so yeah, and like Sarah was like 30, 40 years younger than Moses than Abram.
Yeah.
Like something like along. But anyways, so she was still way more beautiful. But anyways, so Abram being completely like dramatic, he's like, they're going to kill me. So instead, so that we can have favor, we'll say that you're my sister, right? And so because of the princesses, Pharaoh's sisters or family relatives, whatever, they noticed how beautiful she was. They passed on the information to Pharaoh. Pharaoh noticed how beautiful she was.
Sarah.
Sarai, yes. And so Pharaoh, Sarai. And so Pharaoh gave a lot of gifts to Abram for Sarah,
Oh,
Sarai.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
To take her as a concubine.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Makes
Yeah?
sense. Yeah.
So, like,
Dang.
he gives all of these gifts, right? Amongst those gifts, there's obviously food, all that stuff that he was searching for. But also there were servants, and amongst those there were female servants. And it's believed that, because they don't mention Hagar at that
Right.
point, but it's believed because it's mentioned female servants,
that
that she was
given at
amongst
that
them.
point.
and that's how
Okay.
they acquired servants, because they
Wow.
weren't of like
Yeah.
class in order to have servants, but they had that, right?
Wow.
So no, but what we need to remember, or what we need to know about the story, is that she was taken, Sarah was taken, but not only was she taken as a concubine to Pharaoh, but it was Abram's idea to give her up so that he could be like come out of it like okay. And God was the one who actually rescued her and took her out. I don't know how long she was there. I think it was like 5-10 years, something like that.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, she was there for a long time
As a
as the
slave.
concubine, as
Oh.
basically, well, yeah,
Mm.
as a slave. It's a sexual slave, but it's a slave.
That's not what I. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I forgot.
So now we can come back to the story.
Biblical
She's
tea.
then rescued. She's taken back
Wow.
by God. She's now okay, and now it's her idea
to
to
do
give
kind of the
Hagar
same. Yeah.
up, which is her slave,
Wow.
Yeah.
as the concubine to her husband. So to do the same that has been done unto her,
Yeah.
basically. And that's
Wow.
something that we forget in the story, but like
Forget,
it's
didn't
so
know.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
it's crazy, and something that like
I
was
didn't know that she went. I knew that they asked for her, but I didn't
Yeah.
know that she went.
yeah, and it was God who like saved her, like took her out from that.
Wow.
But like, you know, it's crazy. But it's crazy. I think what's crazy to me, and what like I think is so relevant for us today, is how many times like we can't move forward. Like, we live on a basis of our suffering, and we live on a basis of our trauma, like the
Yeah.
things that we've gone through.
Yeah.
Like, we may move forward, God may have rescued us from there, but how we even move forward, how we live forward, because also before like the famine, God had already given Abraham the word that he was going to be the father of nations, and God had given Sarai the word that she was going to be pregnant, and that's when she laughed and she was you know, but like it was taking longer than what she thought was going to take. 10 years had gone by and nothing had happened, so she's like, hello, and so she takes matters into her own hands, but it's all from the point of her suffering. It's all from the point of her trauma that she's doing that. So even with the promise of God, she's moving with God's promise, when she goes up to, when she goes to Abram, she says, the Lord had prevented me from having children. She acknowledges the fact that God prevented her, but also acknowledges the fact that God said that she will, you know? So she's moving in God's word and in God's promise, but she's moving with still her identity, not in God, but her identity in her past, which I think is also one of the main reasons why she does everything in the way that she does. Anyways, that's to remember to start the story with that. It's really important to start that.
That is very important.
Isn't she also the half sister of Moses? Sorry, Moses. Abraham.
Oh yeah.
Like they
Sarah?
have the same. Yeah, they have the same dad, but not
Yeah.
no.
I don't know exactly.
They either
think
share
everything was
the
kinda-
same mom or the same dad.
Yeah.
Because she said, even he says in there that we share the same dad, but like we're siblings, but we don't share the same dad.
I think that's why also
Yeah.
when they went into Egypt, they said that as well.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't them lying, but it was just not
Oh my
them.
gosh.
telling
Also,
the
he
truth.
didn't, he wanted to lie to people that she wasn't his or something like that.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, that's crazy. Okay.
So now that we know that,
So now that we know that, we know where Sarai was coming from. You know how she, they came upon Hagar, all this stuff. So now, kind of fast forward-ish to, Abram, sorry, because this is still before the
this
covenant.
is before, yeah.
Yeah. She's like, okay, we got to have kids, pretty much. Right? Am I wrong?
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, why don't you, go have relations with my slave, because I can't give you any kids. I'm too old. And then immediately gets angry about that.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm so stuck in this beginning story. Like, that's earth shattering. Like,
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. That's wild. Sorry. But yeah, it's true. What I also think is crazy, it's just to add more accumulation against Abram. You know, because we're girl power over here. Like, Sarah's like, go ahead and sleep with my slave. And he's like, okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, this is the other piece of
thing.
tea.
Oh.
Okay, so
The tea continues.
tea.
Tea time with Julie.
Oh.
I
Sorry,
like that.
was Alexa. In case you have an Alexa, I have a challenge for you. You can tell her, good job. And she goes, thanks for the feedback.
Oh yeah,
I
she
just
does say
changed the
that.
words.
Oh, wow.
That's
Tea
true.
time with Julie.
I like that. Okay.
Cute.
She harmonizes with herself. I can't do that.
Okay. So, sorry.
We got a lot
Thank
to
you.
get through. We
Yeah,
barely
we've got a lot
scratched
to get
the
through.
surface.
That's why. Okay, so don't quote me on this. In other words, go do your own research and like fact check, entirely. But apparently, Abram's like agreement at that point with what Sarah's proposal is, or Sarai's proposal is, to go and sleep with her slave, in the original text is similar, if not the same, as when Adam ate from the fruit with Eve. In other words, like what it's insinuating is not just the fact that they are that he is going to, like, that he's in agreement with, but that they sinned, that they did something that was outside of what God had said.
Yeah.
Because this was not a part of God's plan. This was not what God said. God said that Abraham was going to be father of nations, and he said for Sarah that she was going to bear children.
Yeah.
But they took matters into their own hands, and Sarai took matters into her own hands, and he just kind of went along with it. And he was like, okay,
Yeah.
literally,
Which is very Adam and Eve core,
very Adam and Eve.
if you will. Yeah, super interesting.
Fallen world.
And so obviously this happens. Sarah kind of gives up Hagar to Abram. You know who I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Sarah, anyway. And obviously Hagar is like not ecstatic about this. I don't know. The first time I read this, I was kind of like surprised at Hagar, like that because it says like, and then Hagar starts treating Sarai with contempt or something. That she's like upset with her, and then Sarah kind of like fights back in a way. That's at least how I used to read it. It was like Hagar, like, why are you being so dramatic? But then you look at it and it's like, well, she didn't want that. Like she didn't choose any of it. She didn't choose to be like Sarai's like slave, and she didn't choose to have this moment or whatever you want to call it with Abram. Like there were so many things that like she went through that like she didn't choose. And so obviously it's not like super happy with Sarah, and then Sarah just kind of turns on her and is like, from this moment you can really see like a lot of like contempt is the only word that I can think of, like in this relationship. Like this is really where that was kind of born, if you will, like this tension, which to be honest like leads all up until like Hagar eventually has to leave. Well, she gets sent out 2 times, actually, which is really crazy. But the first time that she goes is like kind of like what I was mentioning at the beginning. You can really see how God is so good to her, and also to Ishmael. Like I think she leaves the first time. Actually, let me like fact check myself here. She runs away.
Yeah, she
runs away the first time. The second time she gets sent away as like that's the final. But the first time she runs away, and this is when an angel like appears to her and tells her like what her son's name is going to be. Like she also gets this prophecy about him like not getting along with his relatives, which is kind of funny to me. I don't know what you guys think about that. Yeah, very like it's kind of interesting to me, that little prophecy, because it's not necessarily a nice thing, Yeah. Like the angel's not like, oh, and your son will be perfect in all ways. Like, no, your son's gonna have some problems and he's gonna be a bit wild, It's like an interesting prophecy. But yeah, and like she has this whole moment really with God, which is actually really cool because she's an Egyptian.
Yeah.
And really like I was actually talking to one of the girls, to Tenda earlier about this, and it's really cool like how God was like, I don't know, we think of God and and like Israelites versus, or Jew versus Gentile, you know, we think of that in like the New Testament.
Yeah.
But actually, like, God was speaking to Gentile here, you know, which is
Exactly.
very, very, very beginning of the Bible,
Yeah.
of the whole story. But God was actually, that was something that wasn't like a afterthought, you know.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, the Gentiles are going to be included later, or like, oh, because this happened, I guess we'll include them, you know.
Yeah.
God was like, no, from the beginning, I want a relationship with you, which is really
Yeah.
cool. But yeah, God is so good to her, especially after such a like difficult moment.
Yeah.
And then she goes back.
I think it's something that people relate with the story, and they have a lot of difficulty kind of like swallowing it because of the fact that Hagar has no choice in the say, and you know, like she just literally gets taken. And like, let's not forget that, like, I don't know how old Hagar was, but like Abram was old, you know. So like, not only is she taken away, but like she's not consented for anything, you know. And in like an age like today, where like consent is everything, and like, you know, people look back at the story, and I think this is one of the areas where people really like question God and like God's goodness and God's love. Like, if God is such a loving God, if God is such a kind God, why did he allow for this to happen, you know? And I think this is always what puts in question of like, if God is such a loving God and kind God, why does he let good things happen to, like, bad things happen to good people, you know? But I think we get so fixated on the suffering that we don't we forget to see who's actually suffering the most in this, you know? And actually I think it's God, because he has gone through the highest suffering, because there's only one who was good, and that was Jesus. Everybody else has a little bit of bad in them, if not a lot of bad, you know. So actually God related, and he understood her so much so that he was like what you were saying, like she was an Egyptian, but not just like God pursued her and like and said you like gave her the name, but afterwards she worshipped God. It said like she praised God and thanked God because she knew that he was good. And like the name Ishmael, it means like that God hears her cry, or God hears like her sorrow.
It's actually an Arabic name.
Yeah,
it's not even a Hebrew name.
No,
he like gives her an Arabic name to name her child.
Yeah,
because she's Egyptian.
But like it has to do with like hearing like the cry. You know, it has to do with like hearing the mourning. Basically, like God heard like your despair. Yeah. And so not just that, but every time that Abraham has to think about his firstborn, he has to hear that the like continuous declaration of the fact that God heard her cry. You know, and that's just crazy. And so for me to hear, like we like to look at the suffering and be like, God is such a bad God, but like, why aren't we looking at her? She's an Egyptian who didn't grow up in a Christian household, who didn't grow up, if she was a slave even over there in Egypt and then went to be a slave there in Canaan, then probably she didn't really have an upbringing where she was like connected with God. So not only did she hear God's voice and she was able to relate with it and stuff immediately, but she turned around and immediately praised him, even though she had just been, if we like to call it that, raped. And she now was running away because she was bearing a son that she didn't even want, you know, and she needed, and God, not only that, but God was saying, go back, go back, you know, like,
and submit even. She's
like,
so submit under the authority that.
So I think, of course there is that suffering, but I think it's a reminder that of God, like saying that like you're not alone in your suffering. I'm with you, you know, like you can focus and look at your suffering and be stuck in that suffering, and we can look at that, or you can hold on to my promises, and my promises are greater than anything, you know. And I think that for me is like huge. And the fact that she was like worshipping, again, she comes from no context of anything, and she's a slave and she's worshipping God, and I'm a child of God, and I struggle to worship God, you know. I don't know, she's amazing.
I think there's such a beauty in that, like what you were saying about Hagar, is that how you say? In that restoration, and like how that like goodness that he was bringing, because we look at the suffering, we're like, oh yeah, like she had to suffer because she went through all of these, but also God was so good to her that like that goodness multiplied into Abraham, that multiplied also into Sarah, that like also restored their lives, you know. Although I feel like in that time, like I feel like Sarah will compare, because she was like, maybe, oh, she has the baby, I wanted to bear it, like she has all of these. And like that comparison, like in all of that sense, like God still had promises for Sarah, and not because she made that mistake that took the promises away from her, or like not because Hagar was now bearing a kid that wasn't supposed to be born or whatever, like wasn't, like I think was always in the plan because it happened, and God still loved that baby and did so many things. We don't see that God will choose and will remain besides the people that like he still promised things, you know. He said, I'll be with you, and like he said it even in the good and the bad, you know. He didn't like left them in the sense of like, oh, now you made a mistake, now I'm gone, like by you sin, now you have to carry this baby by yourself. No, he was like, please bring it back, because I'm gonna restore this, and I'm actually gonna multiply, you know, like the same thing, like Israelites or Gentiles, nothing, Gentiles, and like the same thing. Like we never saw that, like as Abby was saying, we never saw that actually God was calling Gentiles and his chosen people since the beginning, you know, like his plan was always to be perfect. And I don't know, I feel like I relate with Sarah and Hagar. Like I love it because I'm like, well, I've been through like both of them, like not that I've been like, you know what I mean. But I feel like I identify because God will like choose to still love each one of them with the mistakes and still use them for like greater things that they expected, you know, and still remain in their promises. Beyond the promises, like he will remain like staying with them. And I think that's like the goodness that was multiplied over that decision of like, oh, I'm gonna run away because I have this baby that I don't want to abort, and God is actually, no, come back, I'm like gonna carry this with you. Like who will do that, you know? Like this is the worst woman maybe, but and actually she's again in one chapter, but there's so much that we can take from her, you know. It's just not hidden, but like we need to look at it, as Julia was saying, not with the eyes of like everything is suffering, is so bad, why is God so bad or evil and like allow these things, but that's just the consequences of our decisions. Like I don't know, I think it's so important to see that.
Yeah, I think also like kind of like what you were saying earlier as well, how you read these stories and you kind of like you have a certain idea of what is going on, you know, that like maybe isn't actually what happened. Like I don't know, for me this story, especially with Ishmael, I was always kind of like, dang, he really got the short end of the stick. Like he kind of like I was always kind of like, God, why, you know, like why did this happen, you know, or that like he was this forgotten kid, you know, because you always hear about Isaac and you hear about the sacrifice that didn't happen and that everything is born out of Isaac, and you're like, yeah, but he's not even the firstborn, you know. Like when you look at it from like kind of an outside perspective, especially like in those times, it's like firstborn was everything, you know. So the fact that like he didn't really he did receive a lot, you know, but like from my perspective, like when I first read this, I was always like, Ishmael kind of like got screwed over, you know. And like in some ways he didn't live like maybe an easy life, or the life that like Isaac had. Not that Isaac had an easy life, but you know what I'm saying. Like I think also there was actually a lot of like, I think Abraham also had a lot of love for Ishmael, you know, that like kind of gets looked over. Like there's when God is like doing the covenant with Abraham and is like telling him, this is going to be your new name, like you're going to be the father of nations, I'm going to multiply you, and Abraham even says like, and can you like also bless Ishmael, like I want you to also bless him, you know. And God's like, okay, because you asked, I'll bless him, you know. Which is actually so cool, you know, that like he wasn't forgotten, you know, or he wasn't like this, like because his mom was Egyptian and the slave woman, and because things were difficult, like you said, you know, in the midst of suffering, like he wasn't forgotten at all, you know, that like Abraham loved him and God loved him, you know. So I think it's something that kind of also, like you were saying, like Hagar's story is so small, but there's like so like these little things that actually have so much in them of God's character. It's really interesting. But yeah. Kind of like continuing. So then Ishmael like grows up. It's about like, I think it says he's like 13 or so when Isaac is first being weaned. That's the word that is used. Which we've talked about this in past episodes. I don't actually know. Like, I don't know if any of us actually Googled that, when a child starts being weaned by their mother in biblical times. Because remember, you were like a couple years old. You were like
3 months.
3 months. Okay.
But that was in Moses' story. I don't know about Ishmael's story.
Oh, sorry. yeah, so Isaac is like
For Ishmael's 3 years.
he was weaned at 3 years.
3 years.
Oh, okay. So, but I think at this point, Ishmael is around 13 or so, and Isaac is first like kind of stepping away from mother, and this is when Sarah sees Ishmael making fun of Isaac, and she's so harsh. She says, "We need to get rid of that slave woman and her son. He's not going to share the inheritance with my son. I won't have it." Yeah. It's a bit intense.
Just a little bit.
And so Abraham is kind of like, okay. I think it says that he's like sad, but he sends them away in the morning or something. Like he packs things up for them and then they go.
Yeah.
And this is another time where like God really shows up for Hagar and Ishmael, which is really cool. I think they see like another angel comes to them. No?
Yeah.
Sorry, just to go back.
Yeah.
You're running, so I have to find where you are.
Sorry.
To go back, like I think something really powerful is, at least with Sarah, we look at her as also the mother of nations, but it's really interesting to see how strong resentment can be.
Yeah.
And how even looking at the whole situation before, like she was acting out of a resentment from what she had experienced, and even still 13 years later or something, whatever you said, she's still in that place of resentment. And yet like I don't know, sorry, going back like with Hagar in the bit before, she's the abused woman, she's the victim, she's the slave, she's the one who is obedient to submit to her masters who want to misuse her, and then she's the one that is kicked out because they're jealous that now she's pregnant, and yet she's the one that has an encounter with God.
Yeah.
And so I think it's so powerful to see how God is for the victim, actually, despite where they come from or what their context is. Like, God is actually for the victim. And so, yeah, maybe Sarah has the reputation of being like this amazing woman, but when you actually read it, she wasn't. But Hagar is the one who had an encounter with God, which I think is so much more powerful than a reputation, you know? And I would take that any day. And so even looking here, like, this shows me that even 13 years later, she's still with that resentment in her heart. And so it's really powerful to see how if we don't break those cycles, like if Sarah would have forgiven Abram, if Sarah would have forgiven also Pharaoh, if Sarah would have forgiven Hagar and allowed like that encounter that Hagar had, maybe she doesn't know anything about it, but had she have like been a bit more in touch with God in the moment, she wouldn't have wasted 13 years cultivating this huge seed of resentment to the point that she talks to a little boy something like this. Get rid of that slave woman and her son. Like, that is because she has been festering resentment for a long time. So I think what that speaks to me is not to judge Sarah, but it's like, wow, we can so easily hold on to a seed for such a long time, even as the chosen people of God, or as Christians, or as the children of God, or whatever. But like, the one who gets the encounter, the one who gets the miracle with God, is the one who is humble and obedient, even if she's obedient to her masters. So I just think that's really powerful. So beyond, I don't really know so much the story of Ishmael or the argument with him and Isaac, but just reading, like, Sarah is still in that place of resentment, and that is so powerful and such a warning sign, I think. So yeah, that's something that just stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that happens so much, like when we see God like make miracles happen for people that like are a complete mess, and we're like, why is that happening to these people? And like, I've been serving the Lord, you know, but I think it's because, one, we're holding on to the promises that God has given us as if they are our promises, and therefore like my right, you know, and we're not actually like surrendering them to God and actually putting God at the center, but also being dependent on him on a daily basis, but instead just feeding from that last promise. So that's what Sarah did. Sarai, God gave them this promise. She was holding on to that, and she took that upon herself. But Hagar's heart, and like in everything, she kept wanting to please her masters, and in that she was also because it was a dual effect. She was pleasing her biggest master as well, which is why she went back with, because, you know, when going back again, when it says that she had contempt and that, like, you know, that she went away, and that's what like frustrated Sarai, it was because she technically now had status. She had power. Like, she had, like, she now went from being a slave to like being like the woman of the house, if you think about it, you know, like she had something that Sarai didn't have.
Yeah.
And that Sarai not only wanted, but that God had promised to her.
Yeah.
So in Sarai's eyes, like, that was a threat in a way, you know? And also, I think Hagar realized that. So that's why she looked at her with contempt, because, like, contempt is almost like a, you know, like, I could care less about you in a sense, you know? But Sarai saw this as a threat and kicked her away. And she's like, but still, after all of that, she still is submitting to God and what God is saying. And actually, God makes Hagar a promise that she's saying that she's going to be a descendant. She's going to have more descendants that she can count, which is a very similar, if not the same promise that God makes to Abram, you know, like, and how amazing and how faithful that God was doing that. And I don't think it's that he was giving that to Hagar and not to Sarai. I don't think it was like either one or the other. It was just that actually she was receiving what was rightfully Sarai's.
Well, actually, sorry to fact check you, but the promise with Sarai and Abram happens after Hagar. So actually, everything happens with Hagar, and then after that, God, like, Hagar has Ishmael when Abram is 86 years old, and the promise comes to Abram when he's 99.
Wow.
So actually, like, it's true everything you're saying.
No, but that's the promise about him being the father of nations.
Yeah.
But the promise that he was going to have a son, doesn't that come before? I don't know,
this whole thing of like Abram fell face down and he laughed to himself, will a son be born to a man of 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Then God said, yes, your wife Sarah will bear you a son. I think it's after.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. Maybe there's another part before. I haven't read it, but at least Genesis 16 is the story of Hagar, and Genesis 17 is the story of them. So, it's very interesting. Yeah.
But again, the lineage happened through Abram. So I think even the fact that she would have descendants was also because it was I think it was a blessing that was already bestowed upon Abram that was bred to Hagar because she had his children as well. Which is also why Ishmael, he was promised that he was going to be this wild person, and that his family wouldn't like him either. And it's obvious because he's not pure, but at the same time he is a part of the inheritance, which is why he's also blessed. And so is Hagar as well. Like at that point, the most prized possessions that you would have would be your inheritance of people, right? Your race. So the fact that she was now a part of leaving that, like, she didn't have that before, and she never thought she would, or like I don't think it ever came to her mind, whatever, you know. So in one sense, I just think it's like also just amazing that God does that with her, being who she was, but at the same time that he also didn't keep that from Sarai, you know, that he also still continued to bless her, even though she was like kind of stuck that like, oh, like she's taken my spot in a sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think both Sarah or Sarai, it doesn't really matter, and Hagar are both victims. They're both sold as concubines. They're both experiencing like injustice in many ways. It's just that Hagar chooses a perspective and an attitude of submission, and Sarai chooses a perspective of bitterness at the end of the day. And what is amazing is that the compassion and the mercy of God is woven through to still give Sarah a child. And even when Sarah laughs, as you were talking about before, even when Sarah laughs in the face of God because she doubts him so much, God's mercy is still prevalent. So I think it's interesting because I don't know, I haven't necessarily been a victim, especially in this kind of a context at all. But I think it's a highlight to see like, wow, we have a choice as when we are victims of situations to see how we respond. Because Hagar had all the right to complain and to laugh and to be really upset and evil, and she ran, but to run isn't necessarily evil, you know. She ran because she was in danger of her life. because Sarah was mistreating her. But we have a choice in our victimhood to choose like what Hagar did, which was yes to run, but at the same time to have an encounter with God where he was able to promise her something that doesn't actually look good, and her to say, wow, God, thank you. Or we have the opportunity to be like Sarah, who remained bitter for 13 years because they had the same circumstances.
Yeah. And again, Hagar's response, like when she's in the desert and the angel speaks to her, is like, you are the God who sees me. And then she says again, have I truly seen the one who sees me? Like, her reaction could have been of that of a victim, and could have been like, you left me or whatever, and like been really bitter and angry and like gone back to Egypt, you know. But instead she chooses to like thank God. So thanking, like, it's crazy, thanking and praising God in a moment that should be like your hardest moment in a sense, you know. Sorry, just was really taken aback.
That coin drop.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah, I think it also taught, like, for me, like, the word that comes to mind is also, like, faithfulness, you know? Like, how faithful God really is to Abraham, to Sarah, to Hagar, like, to all of these people, actually, you know? And even, like you're saying, Maddie, to Sarah, who is someone that, like, really struggled with bitterness and lived in a lot of, like, resentment and also control in a lot of ways. I think she also, like, pushed Hagar in that whole situation so that way, like, she could get a result that, like, she felt that she needed or that she felt like needed to happen, you know? Because actually I was reading, there's, like, I think there's 2 separate times where God or maybe not. Anyways, it doesn't really matter the order. What matters is that God like really like made a covenant with this family and said, I'm going to be faithful to it. Yes or yes, you know? And I'm going to use these people because like I want to, and I want my love to, and my glory to be seen in this, you know? So even like going back kind of, Maddie, to what you were saying, like how she, like Sarah was like really imperfect actually in a lot of ways, you know? And when you look at the story on surface level, you would think that that's Hagar. It's actually Sarah, you know?
Yeah.
And yet God still really used her, you know? He used both of them, you know? But I think it, like, I was kind of saying this before in the New Year's episode that we did, where we were talking about, different things, doesn't matter. But I was saying how, like God knows us so well and is so faithful to us, and it gives me a lot of peace, you know, to know that. And I think like in this story, I like, you can really see how God uses us despite your like failings, you know, or maybe the ways that you get caught in things, you know, that God was like, no, I still want to do things in you, and I still, like, I made this promise to you and I'm going to be faithful to it, you know?
Also seeing that, like, having an encounter with God, excuse me. As we were saying, like Hagar had like that encounter with God that like transformed her life, but it wasn't just a feeling of a moment, you know? Like how many times like we have an encounter, but it's like, okay, that was yesterday, like I'm done, like the next day or whatever. But you can choose to continue having encounters with God for him to transform you and like keep giving you what he has promised, or like keep like being restored, or like having one encounter and like remain in your sadness or your bitterness or your pain or your past or whatever, and like just choosing to remain there. And also see God's character as well, that like he doesn't move by feelings, you know, because like you like didn't hear me when I give you this encounter, like now I'm not gonna speak to you again. No, he kept trying. He kept like giving opportunities and giving mercy and grace and love and all these things that you can see God's like identity and fingerprint and like all over it. And I'm like, how like he thought, like he's God, of course he thought about it before, you know, he knew that was going to happen, so he still remained and choose to like love them, you know, and remain like with them throughout all of it. It just blows my mind.
Sorry, to fact check myself, there is the promise before. Sorry. It's also very interesting, but I think it's also interesting because there's a promise and then it takes time. Maybe that was also the point that you made that I was checking, but there's a promise made and then it's like, oh, I don't think it's possible anymore. So that's wild. But sorry, just to fact check myself.
No.
But I think even, so we gave Sarah a lot of crap. Or Sarai a lot of crap.
Sorry.
That's also so powerful, though.
Exactly.
Like, God, is that what you're going to say? You can go ahead.
No, go for it, because you had a little moment.
Because God changes our name, and he changes Abram's name too. And I think there's something so powerful about before and after with God, that he has the capacity to wipe things clean. And sure, there's a process of change, and God was so patient with them in their process of changing and actually being also faithful back to God. But I think it's also powerful that God was so interested in them living out who he actually called them to be, that he said, you know, I'm going to change their name. And so I just think that's really powerful.
Yeah. No, sorry. Exactly. No. Like, I think, God makes a promise from the beginning. She doesn't respect it. She does things with herself. And I think it's so important to remember that, like, when we don't know, like, we can know how to address God because we know, like, formalities. But the God that we know how to address may not be a God that we know, really. Because if she really and truly knew God, then she would have just rested and trusted the fact that his promises are yes and amen, right? As we say. And she wouldn't have, like, been like, it's been 10 years. The clock is ticking, because God said that this he will do, But she not only continued, like, to pursue that, but even when there is this whole restoration and this is happening, like, I think I can see a changed heart. Yes, it took a while. Yes, like, in the process, I think it really didn't help that Hagar was there. When Hagar left the room, things did get a little bit softer. And I think that talks a lot about women and jealousy in general. And I think that is a thing. I think as women, especially women, when it comes to competing and when it comes to also our place and when it comes to us as in our household, because I think that's the thing that we were given, to be mothers and to be wives, like, it was a thing for us, we were made for that in a sense. And so when that is threatened by somebody else, like, it consumes us. I think sometimes, like, when we see, like, women doing the craziest of things and we're like, I don't understand how this person would do that. Actually, because it's in our nature to like protect what we have. So in many ways, like, Sarai moved in such a way because she was defending what she was losing. She was also losing hope for. But I also have to give it to her, especially towards, like, the whole the whole part of, like, when Abraham has to take Isaac for, like, sacrifice, Sarai was also a part of all of that, and she also was still really submissive to Abram. Let's remember back to, like, when she was given to Pharaoh. You don't hear that she, like, said anything. Even when Abram was like, you're too beautiful, she wasn't like, thanks, babes. And, like, afterwards was like, okay, fine, I'll go to Pharaoh. Like, that must have been really hard for her too. Yeah, she held on to that bitterness for probably a really long time, but she also was really submissive. She also held, like was under him for a long time and, like, also, like, was following him, he was the one that was, like, leading the family, and in many ways also she, like, followed in that way. And so when finally her only son then needs to be taken, like, for sacrifice, like, I would have been like, what? Like, but, like, not only, like, Abram as well, but I think, like, as a mum, I don't know, like, I'm not a mum, but, like, that fruit of your loins and, like, being able to, like, get that and whatever, and, like, just being submitted under God firstly, and then under your husband, like, it's a lot, and I think it shows a lot about also how she's really, like, continued to be under, and, like, so sure, she had awful attitudes throughout, but at the same time she was still, like, under, like, she knew who her master was. She stayed with that bitterness, which is what caused trouble, but she knew who her master was, and she knew also who, like, like, at all points, she, like, when she's referring to the Lord, she knows who his name is. She knows, like, the order of things and stuff. It took her a while to get to, like, the understanding fully, but so Hagar is amazing. Not gonna deny that. But Sarai also has a full turnaround, I think.
Also, to cut her some slack, like, maybe she's resentful, but she's also grieving. Like, I don't know, I work with a lot of women whose bodies have been used, or who feel incompetent, or who feel damaged, or who have faced really awful situations. And like when Abraham is promised descendants, at that point Sarah had been a concubine, like who didn't bear children until that point. So I'm sure at that point she's like, well, clearly, like she says herself, the Lord has kept me from having children, but I wonder if she thinks that is a punishment. I wonder if she thinks like it's because I've been a concubine. Like at that point, maybe she's been with many men, not because it was her own choice, but at that point her body feels damaged. Her body feels broken and used, and she's also elderly. So I don't know. I think like resentment doesn't just come out of nowhere. And sometimes it can come out of our injustice, but I think it also comes from grief and many things. Like she was probably grieving the loss of her capacity to have a child. You know? And that was maybe the motivation of putting Hagar and Abram together, but maybe she was hoping the whole time it wouldn't work. You know, maybe she was like, oh, like, okay, do this and then see that I'm not the problem. And then it works. And she's like, I am the problem. Like all of my fears just came true, you know, which just gives more space to all of those lies. So it's true. Like she had a huge turnaround, but I also like, I don't know, I feel like there's many people out there, maybe even you guys that are watching, that feel like damaged or feel like there can't be restoration from the things that you've gone through. And I think it's so powerful to see Sarah's like story of restoration and how she didn't have the best attitude throughout it, but God had another plan, you know, even when, it's just interesting. Wild.
Yeah, I also wonder if like the way that she treated Hagar also had something to do with her guilt about it, you know? Like I imagine also, in case it was me, like in case I put myself in her shoes and I make this slave woman like have relations with my husband, she gets pregnant, and I know that this was supposed to be a promise that was supposed to be for me, you know? And like I think you mentioned it as well, like this jealousy that comes from that. And then eventually Sarah does get her baby, you know? And God like then is like, I am still good and I am still with you, you know? I imagine actually she probably felt so guilty. Like she probably felt really like, also like, I don't know for sure, you know, because it doesn't say that in the Bible. So I'm not trying to like come up with some blasphemy. But if it was me, I think I would feel really guilty that I did this to this girl, you know? And I think like if I look at my own life, like so many times where I like feel guilty or I know I did something wrong, it's like, oh, I don't like that feeling, you know? And probably she like really rejected Hagar and wanted her away, because the second she saw her, she was like, she saw like also the ways that she kind of like failed God in a way, not failed God, but like turned away from him and said, actually, I want to take this promise that you gave to me. And I don't want it to be yours. I want it to be mine, you know? And God was like, no, but I'm still going to be faithful to you. And I'm still going to be good. And she probably like, I imagine that was like a really hard pill to swallow. Like, I don't imagine that was very easy. So I imagine also seeing Hagar all the time was really difficult.
I mean, like even like, when Hagar, sorry to go back to when she's out in the desert, you know, like running away. But when she's out in the desert, she's the one who's talking to God. At no point do we see Sarah. Angel. Like, well, it's the angel, but then she says like, is this the voice of God that I hear, you know? And I think because at that time, like, the whole angel and God thing was like just kind of like quite connected. I mean, again, like it was like one thing. Anyways, we can look more at that later.
Yeah, different.
But
topic.
Anyways, the whole point is that she's having these communications, but not Sarah. But how crazy though that like God is the one who says you're going to call him Ishmael, and that means that God listens because I have heard your cry, right? She goes back and she has to say, I'm pregnant, I've got your son because you made me pregnant, and this is going to be his name, while she's still a slave. Yeah. And not only that, but then also Sarah has to like be okay with that, you know? And his name means God hears, and because like the word is because God heard her cry. Yeah. So that feeling of like, you know, guilt is every time she has to call the first son of her husband. Yeah. Every time that she declares his name, then she knows that God heard her cry, and that like, you know, like in a sense,
her cry of her own wasn't heard.
And it wasn't exactly. Yeah. But like not only like her cry wasn't heard also, but like, that at the same time that her, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like Sarah also had to like deal with that on a constant. And finally when she gives birth, to her own child, Isaac, immediately, like, there's the mockering, you know, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
She's like threatened. Yeah. And of course she's threatened.
Yeah, no wonder. Yeah.
But at the same time, she's having this time of rejoicing. She's saying, like, I'm like laughing. Let anybody who hears also laugh and understand that, like, how could it be? Because he's so old, and, you know, like, I have his children, you know, his child. But immediately, like, Hagar and, like, little Ishmael are, like, laughing and stuff, and she sees it as a threat. And I think that's a constant reminder for us as well, that, like, no matter how far we come along, and no matter how much God does and continues to, like, do these promises and everything, we need to remember to, one, keep humble, but two, to remember to, like, not hold on to those wounds from the past. Yeah. Because as we keep holding on to those wounds from the past, we can't keep moving forward. And so she wasn't able to move forward until Hagar was completely out of the picture. And that's why the prophecy was that, like, Hagar's child was going to be like a wild thing, because he was going to grow up in the wild. It says that he grew up in the wild, and then his mum found an Egyptian wife for him. Yeah. So he was completely removed from, like, this inheritance that actually belonged to him. But that also had to do because Sarai, like, sent them to go out into the wild. Now, Abraham didn't want that to happen. Yeah. That's why he was, like, still, like, loved him and whatever. Yeah. And he still asked for God to promise him, bless him, which is amazing. Yeah. But at the same time, Sarai couldn't let go of that wound, the fact that she was the one who bared the child, the fact that she was the one who had that promise, the fact that she was the one that spoke to God, you know. And in that whole time, she's only speaking to her husband. Yeah, she couldn't let go of that, and the only way for her to move forward was for him to go, like, for her to go, which is sad in a way, but at the same time, I think it was important for her to kind of come through. But at the same time, that it's sad that many times, because of our own insecurities, because of our own stubbornness and our own selfishness, that we need people to go, sorry, that brought a lot of, like, conviction to, like, me. I've had so many moments in my life, and especially in these last few years, where I've had, like, a lot of issues with people, like, especially with, like, close friends, or, like, just felt, like, really, like, betrayed, or, like, I don't know, misused, whatever, you know. And I've come to points where I'm like, no, either this person goes or I'm going to go, you know, or like either this changes or, like, that's it, you know. And I can stay with that, and it can be my right, because, you know, maybe I am right in a lot of things, you know, or I can also let God make me a part of the blessing. I can also receive from being a part of the blessing simply by just staying there and watching things happen, you know. And I can let God heal me and let go of those things, you know. And it's painful, for sure, you know. It's painful also, like, to have to see those people or, like, go through those things, like, for sure, 100%. But I don't want to miss out, because, again, like, okay, they lived until, like, they were, like, what, 400 years old, whatever, like, really old, you know, but we may not get that, you know. She had enough time in order to finish, like, fulfilling that promise and bear that child, but maybe I don't, you know, like, staying in bitterness and all that stuff, like, maybe is what also caused her to, like, not be able to bear children. I don't want to be to the point of, like, holding on to that bitterness against people or against situations or, like, things, to the point that it leaves me isolated without God, and living in the fullness, you know. Maybe a lot of things that are, like, not happening in my life are also because of that, because I'm so stuck in that. So I want to release that. Sorry, I just got really emotional, because, like, I think it's so true that many times we can be so, like, stuck in that position of, like, my right, or, like, until that happens I cannot move forward. And she did move forward finally when Hagar was out the picture, but that it doesn't have to be in that way. And I think God allowed for there to be a second chance, which is why Hagar was sent back, you know. And she wasn't just sent back, but she was sent back, like, God was specific. He said, go back to your master,
to your authority,
to your authority, and submit under her authority. He even gave Sarah another chance as well, in that as well. God's amazing.
I think also, like, that we produce our own suffering, like you're saying, like, when I'm just waiting for Hagar to leave so that I can be better, like, there's a lot of her own suffering produced in that. So I think what you're also sharing, even in your vulnerability, is so powerful, because you're not wanting to like give into your own suffering. You know what I mean? Like, sure, they suffered circumstances, but at the same time, by not releasing, not forgiving, being stuck in that right and in that thing, we like make everything worse.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that's so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Jules.
Yeah.
No worries. I said I really love the story. I think, you know, we always talk about like characters that we'd love to meet and have a conversation when we get to heaven. I think this is a family that I'd love to have like a Jeremy Kyle show. Sorry, no, that was British. What's it called? In America. Like the Family Feud show, but not the Family Feud, not the game.
Springer?
Jerry Springer or something like that.
Monty something.
Yeah. You know, like have God be in one couch and then me being like, question number 1, you know, and then they all sit there. Explain to me this, you know?
Yeah, for real.
Also because I think there's a huge difference in the during, like the before, during, and after, you know? So also like, I'm sure that Sarah in a lot of things probably looks back at this and she's like, you know?
Yeah.
Which is good. I think it's good. I want to be able to look back at my life and be like,
wow, God.
But at the same time, wow, God.
So good.
You're so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen.
This is
This was a
fire.
a meat-filled episode.
Yeah.
if you will.
Sorry.
No, it's really good.
No, I mean, sorry for everybody else who had to listen for like such a long time. I'm not sorry that it was so meat-filled. But, like, yeah.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have like a fun fact to end this little episode.
Yeah.
I was just reading this and I thought it was interesting because to finish her story, they eventually do leave. And that's kind of the last time we hear about Hagar. She goes and God provides for her.
Yeah.
He shows a well, like, and she gets to provide, or like he provides for Ishmael and her. And that's kind of like the last time that we hear about Hagar. Is God providing for her, like I'm sure he continued to do, but we just didn't hear about it. And then Ishmael, we hear about him one last time when Abraham dies, and he goes and has like a little reunion. That would also be interesting to see. If I could be a fly on the wall on that would be cool. And then you hear about like the Ishmaelites a little bit in the Bible, and I thought this was just interesting, but you know, like much later on, also in Genesis, past a few pages, Joseph, his brothers sell him to the Ishmaelites.
It's true.
So the slavery continues. Yeah, isn't that crazy though? He actually gets sold to some Ishmaelites that were from far away on their camels, if you remember the story. Wow. His brothers kind of
that's crazy
backstab there, but yeah, I thought that was interesting, like an interesting tie-in. Because I like, of course, you know, like there's a million like Canaanites, Midianites, lights. But I was like, I wonder what like Ishmael was doing after this whole story, because that's the last time you hear about him. Is he like when Abraham dies, and that's kind of like it, at least that I could find. But there's a few things in the Bible.
I think it might be recording still.
No, it's that some of them say mute.
Oh no.
Okay.
Hello.
Super
I
unfiltered.
wonder how long this has been mute for.
I don't know.
Well,
Oh no.
We'll find out.
Yeah, I guess
we'll find out. Cool. So if you weren't hearing Abby's microphone, now you can hear Abby's microphone.
Hello? I don't know.
Was it yours muted?
Can everyone speak?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. Hello.
These two
Hello.
just aren't
hello.
moving.
It might just be that it's not connected very well.
Okay, let's
hope.
pray that it's
We
just not
trust
connected
the
very well.
Lord.
Amen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
amen.
No.
Hallelujah. Anyways, that's all for this episode.
Wow.
We'll see you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.